Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, the final installment in this four-part Cal Green Embodied Carbon series, Building Reuse for Decarbonization and Compliance, made in partnership with the SEOC Sustainable Design Committee. As you get settled, please feel free to say hello and where you're joining from in the chat today. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides the learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the PDF presentation that can be made available online. We will provide links in the chat box where you can find upcoming and on-demand climate action and ZNCD webinars from AIA California. A few quick housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and can be made available on the AIA California website, aiacalifornia.org. Today's session qualifies for one AIA HSW learning unit and 1 hour of ZNCD mandatory continuing education. For those who stay on and watch live, AIA California will report these units for you and will send you a ZNCD certificate of completion in the coming days. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Finally, cultivate a positive learning environment. AIA California strongly encourages attendees to be constructive in their comments and questions to presenters and to one another to foster a positive learning experience for everyone. I'd now like to introduce our co-moderators who have participated in this Cal Green Embodied Carbon series. Luke Lombardi is a senior sustainability consultant at Burrow Happold. He chairs the SEOC Sustainability Committee and is a co-lead of the CLF LA Hub. Avide Hagigi is an associate principal and sustainable design lead at ZGF. Avide currently serves as the chair of AIA California's Embodied Carbon Working Group. Avide, thank you so much for moderating today's session, the last in our Cal Green Embodied Carbon series, and now I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Excited to have you all with us today on another exciting session about Cal Green. Next slide. So today's speakers that I'm proud to present to you, Irina Brosman at the California Building Standards Commission, who will go through about the requirements for this Cal Green pathway with us today. Hafsa Bert, an architect with HBA Architects and a principal. She will share some project examples. And Isabel Hens, who is with Atelier 10, and she will also share some project examples with us today. So just a reminder, today's session is the fourth session in a series of sessions we have held about Cal Green. This is the fourth and last session, and the recordings of each of the previous sessions can be found on the AIA California website, as will the recording for this session. And today we're covering building reuse pathway. This is the third pathway for meeting Cal Green's embodied carbon requirements. We've already covered the prescriptive path and the life cycle analysis in previous sessions. So today we'll be focusing just on building reuse, what it covers and how to meet those requirements. So again, reminder, all of these requirements kick into effect July 1st of this year. So if you have any projects starting permitting after that date, these requirements will apply to your project. What's covered is non-residential projects that are larger than 100,000 square feet, or public K through 12 schools that are larger than 50,000 square feet. What's not covered is any projects that fall under the non-residential category that are less than 100,000 square feet. Of course, any schools that are less than 50,000 square feet, projects under OSHPD, and residential projects under the HCD authority. So single family, multifamily currently are not covered. So today we'll be speaking a little bit about why existing buildings matter, why you should consider this pathway for compliance. And then we'll go through building reuse for Cal Green compliance, what that means, and examples of what architects and design professionals are doing right now to meet these requirements. At the end, we'll have a short Q&A and answer any questions you may have. So why do existing buildings matter? Well, they're a big part of our building stock. As you can see here, this is the global emissions report pie chart. You've probably seen this 1,000 times now. Buildings make up 40% of global emissions. And if you break that down, it's actually 28% of that is operating emissions from building operations, which majority of it comes from existing buildings, and only 11% is from embodied carbon, which is new buildings. So next slide. So existing buildings have a really big impact, not to mention that we have a ton of buildings. We currently have 235 billion square meters of buildings, and each year we're adding another 6 billion square meters to that. So the existing buildings are not very efficient. We can't afford to replace all of them. We can't afford to leave them alone. The new buildings add new embodied carbon. So obviously it's very beneficial to preserve old buildings and reuse them as much as possible in terms of embodied carbon, but also for economic benefits. So you can see here on the left of the chart is new buildings. So new buildings contribute about 11% to global GHG emissions for embodied carbon, but only less than 0.5% of operational carbon, because new buildings are much more efficient in terms of their mechanical systems and emissions. Existing buildings, on the other hand, because they have old, outdated mechanical systems and maybe not as efficient, not as efficiently run, they have much higher operating emissions. They're contributing big chunk of, in fact, all of that 28% of emissions. So now I'll hand it off to Irina to walk through this compliance pathway in detail with you.
Hello, everyone. So Sarah, next slide, please. So as Abida said, my name is Irina Brausman, and I'm a supervising architect with California Building Standards Commission. And here today to talk a bit about building reuse scope. And even though it was presented as a third pathway in this series, we call it Pathway 1. So I will kind of keep calling this Pathway 1 for this presentation. So the scope of building reuse regulations is basically identical with the scope for two other pathways, the whole building LCA and the prescriptive GWP compliance. And the only difference is that building reuse option is obviously not available to new buildings or buildings where added area is significantly bigger than the existing area. And these regulations are only applicable to quite large-scale projects. So effective in July, that will be 100,000 square feet and greater for non-residential projects within BSC authority, and 50K and greater for public schools and community colleges. It will drop for non-residential buildings within BSC authority to 50,000 square feet, but that will happen in 18 months after this July. So there is time for kind of adjusting. And several things to note on this slide. So the project area considered in the application of these regulations. For alterations, it's combined altered floor area. And for additions, it's actually total floor area combined with the existing building. So, and that is really important to remember when we look at the examples in the next slides. So next slide, please. So here we have example number 1. And we have a building of 3,000 square foot that contains several suites occupied by different tenants. So there is a project to alter 2 suites, and one of those 2 suites is 50,000 square feet, and the other one is 60,000 square feet. And the rest of the building containing several more suites is not altered. So with the calculations, we combine altered floor area of the two suites, and we get the result of 110 square feet, basically 50K plus 60K, and that is over 100K threshold. So the work in both altered suites has to comply with either one of the three available pathways. It can comply with building reuse, it can comply with whole building LCA, or product GWP compliance. The next slide. On the example number 2, we have a commercial building of 30,000 square feet, which is proposed to have two additions, 25,000 square feet and 35,000. So in calculations here, the total area of the additions plus the area of the existing building is 90,000 square feet, which is less than the 100K threshold, meaning the project is not required to comply with any of those regulations. So if the design team decides to comply with them, they are of course welcome, but it's not required. Next slide, please. On the example number 3, we have an addition of 5,000 square feet, and that is proposed to be added to the existing building of 95,000 square feet. So if you think about that, or we are just adding 5,000 square feet to a big building, but in reality, when you do calculations, the total area of the addition plus the existing building need to be considered. And as a result, when we sum 5,000 plus 95, we are over the threshold, meaning that the project has to comply, again, with either one of the three available pathways. However, you also need to think that the entirety of the existing building can be considered in calculations. So the required percentage for the compliance with the building reuse compliance option, and I make it quite an easy case in this one. Next slide, please. So on this example, number 4, we have a retail building of 200,000 square feet, which is proposed for alterations. And the alterations taking place in 80,000 square feet of the building area only. So 80,000 is obviously less than 100, so the project is not required to comply. And in 18 months after this July, as the threshold will be lowered, this type of project will be required to comply though. So you need to be aware of that. Next slide, please. And now we are on the actual requirements for building reuse pathway. So intent of these regulations is to maintain 45% of the existing building primary structure and enclosure. And the primary structure includes, in this case, foundations, columns, beams, walls. The only walls that are included are those which contribute to structural stability of the building, floors and lateral elements. Enclosure includes exterior skin and framing, but excludes window assemblies and insulation. So most building reuse projects will meet the 45% requirements. And if that cannot be achieved, then there are 2 other pathways that are available for the project team to take. And with the verification of compliance, there are a number of different ways to demonstrate compliance to like building officials. And I will show some of them, but there are like tons of others. And also worksheet 3 is provided in chapter 8 of CalGreen to demonstrate compliance. And even though this worksheet is not required to demonstrate this compliance, it's a tool that can be used to do that. And that's quite helpful tool. So you can find more details in our CalGreen guide that was recently published on BSC website also. There is tons of information on this. So I encourage everyone to go there, download, and study the guide. Next slide, please. So here is example number 1 on how to demonstrate compliance of the project. And we have an office building of 50,000 square feet, and that is planned for a following scope of work. There are alterations to 35,000 square feet that do not affect the building primary structural elements. Existing building enclosure is mostly maintained, but existing window assemblies and insulation being replaced. Then there are additions of 10,000 square feet and 80,000 square feet. And the last is 15,000 square feet of existing structure is proposed to be demolished to result in a U shape of the building to be able to provide more natural light. So the first step calculations are to determine if the project is actually has to comply with the regulations. And to do that, we take the total area of the additions combined with the existing building area. And the result is we have 140,000 square feet. So this project is required to comply with either one of the 3 compliance pathways available. Next slide. Step 2 calculations is, like in step 1, we determined, yeah, project needs to comply. But now we need to decide with which option and if building reuse option is even available, considering that we have additions to the building. So we calculate the total area of additions, and that equals 90,000 square foot. And that is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. So the project is eligible to use building reuse option for compliance. And step 3 are actual calculations for compliance. The existing building area is 50K, with 15K being demolished, resulting in the and 35K being altered. However, the alterations do not touch primary structural elements or building enclosure, which was stated on the previous slide. And if you remember from even earlier slides, windows and insulation are excluded from the scope. So even though they were replaced for compliance purposes, we can conclude that 35,000 square feet of the building area are not altered at all, which result in maintaining 70% of the existing building floor area. And projects where anticipated reused floor area exceeds the minimum compliance threshold for the regulations being 45% by comfortable margin, they may be able to demonstrate compliance through a simplified calculation based on existing, demolished, and retained floor area only. So it's up to enforcing agency to determine what the comfortable margin is, but I would say roughly 60% would work. That's, of course, up to enforcing agency, but it can be discussed with them and determined if they accept this type of compliance. And for this particular example, since we have 70% of the building area retained, that exceeds the minimum compliance threshold by a comfortable margin. And the compliance can be shown by simplified worksheet shown on this slide, or just graphic area diagram and provided numbers. So next slide, please. So here we have example 2 for demonstration of compliance. And we have an office building of 50,000 square feet. And that's planned for the following scope of work. Alterations to 25,000 square feet that do not affect the building primary structural elements. Additions of 10,000 square feet and 40,000 square feet, and demolition of 25,000 square feet of the building. And again, same steps. Step 1, we determine if project needs to comply. And the total of the added area combined with the existing building area equals 100,000 square feet. 50K plus 10K plus 40K, basically. And the project is required to comply with either one of the pre-compliance pathways available. Next slide, please. So here on step 2 calculations, we again determine if a building reuse option is available for this project. And as the combined added area equals 50,000 square feet, which is not greater than the double the area of the existing building, the project is eligible to use building reuse option for compliance. And in step 3, we see that demolition proposed is 25K out of 50K of the existing building area, resulting in 50% of the existing building be demolished. So since 50% does not exceed the minimum compliance threshold by a comfortable margin, we recommend that the project team completes worksheet 3 and provides more detailed component-based calculation, because it's really easy to miss things in the simple area, floor area compliance, because things can be demolished, things can be kept, and it's really not possible to show that in a simple area diagram. So next slide, please. So here we have the results of the component-based calculations shown in the table. And on the left of that is guidance for calculating the area of the key structural components. So in this case, you need to consider each component and determine which percentage is retained, which percentage is demolished. Then sum those percentages, get them to the table, and decide what the kind of resulting percentage is for all the elements in the building being demolished or retained. So, and that's the last slide of my presentation. Hopefully that was helpful. And I will be here, so if there are questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Irina. Really, really helpful calculations and going through those from the CalGreen Quick Guide. The link to that resource is in the chat if you do need to take a look at it. And I'll now hand it over to Hafsa for some project examples.
Hi there, my name is Hafsa Burt, and I just wanted to go over a couple of examples to discuss the pros and cons of reusing a building. The first example is next slide, please. The first example is a mixed-use occupancy in San Jose. Both of these projects are constructed. Original construction is from the 1970s, which we all know is prior to the energy operation codes. Anything to do with indoor air quality, water use efficiency. So these are good examples of how the entire pretty much site was reused and as a multifamily complex. I know this is not relevant directly to our CalGreen codes update, which is going into effect in July, because it is residential primarily with mixed-use occupancies of assembly, business, and storage. Next slide, please. Some of the problems that we deal with structures from 1970s is, of course, energy efficiency upgrades, bringing them up to code per current energy code. And then in this structure, some windows were opened up, so 95% of the structure was reused and 65% of the original enclosure was reused because we had to significantly upgrade the insulation for the project to improve its energy efficiency. We also looked into incorporating low VOC materials and diverting as much waste as possible for the green building ordinances in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. The windows were also updated. So if you're familiar with LEED's material and resources credits since 2014, you may have noticed that these requirements are pretty much in line with LEED credits. For the reuse percentage, LEED basically asks for the area or volume of reused elements divided by the total building area, multiplied with 100 to get a percentage. And for CalGreen, we're asking for a quantity of reused materials divided by the total quantity of materials in the project to get a percentage. So again, like I mentioned, 95% of the structure was reused and 65% of the enclosure full energy efficiency upgrades were done for HVAC, mechanical systems, and insulation. So it's really important in these old structures to bring them up to a level of energy efficiency per the current codes and not just reuse them without updating them for energy efficiency. Next slide, please. This is another example of a original construction from 1971. The existing occupancy is storage. It was a warehouse construction that was converted from an S to a B occupancy. It's a typical tilt-up concrete construction with large bays on a 6-acre site with a 4-ply built-up roof. And it supported the demand for commercial spaces in the area. And comprehensive, as we all know, from a storage to commercial, some of the problems we dealt with was comprehensive full compliance with accessibility codes, which does become a bit of a cost implication for clients. Energy updates for Title 24. Also, ventilation rates were improved based on ASHRAE 621.1, just to improve the indoor air quality of the space, so it can have occupants. And with the entire 100% of the structure, the tilt-up concrete was used along with the flooring. Next slide, please. So the client requested mezzanines to be added. This finished construction in 2022. The heights were 24 feet, so we were able to accommodate the mezzanine request. And full lighting upgrade, full FLS upgrade for fire life safety, bringing the whole development or the whole structure to the current CBC code, which was 2019 for this project, along with ADA compliance, egress compliance, and making sure that the IAQ was improved because of the ventilation rates. Next slide, please. So if you were doing this project today and you had to comply with the July updates, you will basically include the WS3 form in your sheets. So for the primary structural elements of existing buildings, which includes foundations, columns, beams, walls, floors, and lateral elements, for this project, it would be 100% retained structure with existing area added to the retained total area A plus B. And then for the second row, which says existing enclosure of existing building, like roof framing, if wall framing, exterior finishes will all retain. So for both of these, the last column would say 100%, which will actually qualify more than what CalGreen updates are requiring for. So the reason why I wanted to include it is that despite the fact that we had to bring it up for local zoning, local requirements for parking for the local zoning, which is 1 per 1,000 square foot of commercial space, and show EV parking and show full compliance with ADA and accessibility standards for parking, the structure and the flooring and most enclosure, actually 100% of the enclosure was retained. Next slide, please. So here's a rough summary of our calculations for embodied carbon. The steel for mezzanine, which covered roughly 10,000 square feet, and we used HSS, non-fabricated, which has a 1,710 kilograms per carbon dioxide equivalent per metric ton. You can see the percentages next to the concrete that was reused is negligible. And then the other big factor that I included in this rough calculation is gypsum board for the individual spaces that were created, and the percentage of that embodied carbon GWP percentage of that is 16.90, which compared to the reuse of concrete, which was at 81.33%. So this just kind of shows you that just by retaining the structure and the enclosure and changing the occupancy of an existing building, which was vacant, helped us to kind of advance our plans toward embodied carbon reduction measures, and yet have a commercially viable building. But be aware that we do need to comply with the current codes for energy, for accessibility, for fire life safety, and bring it up to current codes, which can be cumbersome besides the documentation process for the enclosure and the structural elements of the project. And so that's all I had to cover, just to show that it's doable, completely doable. It is a little bit harder, but it's totally doable, and the advantages are go much farther along. So that's I think all I have, and with that, I'll pass it on to Isabel for her exam.
Yeah. And then we just wanted to end with an example that might be familiar to a lot of you. It's Horton Plaza in San Diego, with a really large building area, mixed use program. And we just wanted to use this to show that with significant reuse of the substructure and superstructure of an existing building, you can achieve really high reductions in embodied carbon. So for example, for this project at 100% CD, we did the calculation of if the building would have been all new construction versus the design that the team came up with, we were seeing about a 73% reduction in embodied carbon. So much more significant than anything you would typically achieve with typical embodied carbon reduction measures for a new construction project with the LCA pathway or with the prescriptive pathway. So this is just to show that this pathway really has a really big real world impact and can result in really cool final projects. So that's it in terms of content. We have a lot of time left for questions. So I can hand it over to the main presenters again, and I've kind of grouped the questions in some categories once we start answering those. So I think all the questions left in the questions section are dividable into two big categories. There's kind of the spatial scope of buildings for the purpose of this code, and then there's a temporal scope. So I'll just describe kind of those two high-level ones, and maybe we can start with a higher level discussion and then go into the specific examples and questions. But in terms of the spatial scope, a lot of the questions touch on what constitutes a building for this specific code, and for looking at these area thresholds. So what, for example, if you have one building, but there's two alteration projects with two different permits, or if you have a development that has multiple buildings within it, or if you have a project and you don't want to meet the code and you say, oh, I'm just going to split it up into smaller projects that are all under 100 square foot. So maybe Irina, you could talk a little bit more about how this spatial boundary is defined.
Yeah, so currently, there is no clause for, for the split of the developments. So basically, if the client or design team wants to split the project to avoid those regulations, they can. I mean, that's possible. And there was a question about if we envision the adding that clause in the future. That's possible, because these regulations is just the beginning for this. That's the first time we added those type of regulations. So we want to go easy on project teams, on the project owners, and we considered all of that. So yeah, we currently go easy, but the regulations will most likely be developed further for next code adoption cycles. And it's a possibility that this clause will be discussed. I can't say for sure, but that's possible. And like if people are interested in that, at some point we will have workshops in one of the future cycles. We will have workshops to further develop these regulations, and they will be posted on our website, on the Building Standards Commission website. So I encourage everyone to sign into our distribution list. So as soon as we have a workshop planned, we will send email to all the people who are signed, and you will know that now we are going to discuss next steps, and you can participate in that. So hopefully that answers. Oh, and there were also questions about different buildings in the development. So the project is considered. The project can consist of one building. The project can consist of several buildings. It depends on that. Doesn't matter if it's one or several. So I hope that answered the question also.
Irina, I think there's another question for you. Can you go over the example of adding 5,000 square feet to an existing building? I'm confused. So if the total square footage after adding, I suppose the question is over 100,000 square feet, then yes, this is one of the pathway for embodied carbon reduction measures. I think that's what it's suggesting.
Yes. So basically, if we have a building, existing building, and we add whatever small area, and that addition gets the building, the total area of the existing building plus the addition over the threshold, then the project needs to comply. But again, in that example, I explained that in that particular case, existing building compliance will be pretty easily shown, because you have a huge existing building, and adding just 5,000 to that should not alter too much of the existing structure. So you can show that most of the existing structure is maintained. So that's an easy case.
There's another question about the pathway building reuse. Is the minimum 45% combined of the building's primary structural elements required over the building's history, spanning multiple retail projects, so multiple remodel projects? So no, it is per project, whatever you're submitting currently, not historically what's been done to a building for a project.
Yeah, and that question is kind of related to some of the other questions which relate more to the temporal boundaries. So in general, just what is the time difference between multiple projects that makes them one project versus two separate projects? So somebody brought up multiple renovations done over 3 years. Is that one or is that multiple? What if there's 2 suites, but they're 2 separate permits and they're 30 days apart? Irina?
Yeah, so each project is considered separately. And as I mentioned, currently, in those new regulations, there is no requirement of a time frame. Like you need to wait 3 years before you do other alteration in the building so that you can get out of the compliance. Currently, there is no such a requirement. So technically, it's possible to avoid compliance doing that way. Of course, we don't recommend that.
There's another question, is the BSC maintaining a database of carbon reduction for permitted buildings? So this is actually rolling out in July 2024, and for buildings this size, it'll probably be some time before they're permitted. So I'm supposing that once that starts happening, BSC will start collecting data, right, Irina?
No, because we will not. I mean, when we will have workshops to develop the regulations further, any data that can be provided to us will be welcome. But we as a department, we do not have an instrument to collect the data on our own, because we do not have authority to enforce any regulations, actually, because all the regulations that we propose, they are enforced by different departments, different entities. So we do not have access to that data.
Then could you go over the various compliance options again? So either one of us can take it. Isabel, do you want to take that? Because that's an easy one.
Yeah, so we have the performance pathway in which you perform an LCA and show a 10% reduction in embodied carbon. There's a prescriptive pathway in which you show that you are meeting the embodied carbon threshold for certain main building materials. And then there's the building reuse pathway, which we presented today, which involves reusing the main structural elements and envelope of a building.
So there is one interesting question that I don't know how to answer it, but can you provide an example of a type of project that this regulation is trying to eliminate? I think it's not necessarily trying to eliminate a project. It's just saying, hey, consider reuse, before demolishing a existing building. So like the 2 examples I presented, one is on 6 acres and the other one's on 3.8 acres. So, a lot can be done if those 2 buildings were demolished, but, and like I mentioned, it is hard work to go in and document everything that can be saved and reused. So it's not necessarily discouraging or eliminating a type of project. It's saying it's encouraging reuse of at least 45% of enclosure and structure.
Yeah, and maybe to add on that, so if the decision is made to demolish the building and build new building, so regulations will not go anywhere. There are regulations for new buildings. So that new building will need to comply with either whole building LCA pathway or prescriptive pathway for materials GWP compliance. So this reuse option is, I would say, is the easiest option to go. So on my opinion, I know, Hafsa, if you think the same.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of reuse just because of construction waste diversion, which is an end of life management, which is just two factors. And I think there's a great opportunity to reuse the building stock, and even new construction of today will be an existing building in 10 years. At some point, reuse does become a very important strategy for embodied carbon reduction. There's another question. So if you are only modernizing or adding to an existing 2 wings of an elementary school that combined is 32,000 square feet, but these 2 buildings are part of a whole elementary school, do these regulations apply? So no, it's per project, and the square footage thresholds are based on the project at hand, not the entire development or building. So Irina or Isabel can touch on that too. Okay, so there's a question from Alexa. DSA has an increment structure that allows multiple sets to be submitted sequentially under one submittal number. Are all increments counted as one project? And I think that's a really good question.
So that one is, unfortunately, I can't answer because that's specific for DSA. And I encourage the person who asked to come to contact DSA directly and ask this question, because they have their own separate process for permitting, and they are enforcing agency. If you compare with our department, we are not. So I unfortunately can't answer that.
One question asks if we could go over in a little bit more detail how we would calculate the areas of components. Irina had a good example. Maybe we can just go back to that briefly and expand on it a little bit since we have some time.
So yeah, that will be the last slide in my book. Yeah, this one. So basically, for different elements, you would consider different area, but that's the surface area. Yeah, and for columns, that is a surface area of a longitudinal column face. That's a recommendation, because again, there are no requirements currently how to calculate that. That's up to the project team to kind of to get to that point and get an agreement with enforcing agency. So if you come up with other ways to calculate that, you just need to think in terms of do not compare apples with oranges kind of thing. So if you start calculating surface area of longitudinal column face for existing elements, then you will need to do the same for new elements and like existing elements that are demolished. So to compare the same things for the same items. So yeah, that's the gist of that. And for walls, that's obviously surface area on one side. For slabs, gross floor area. But again, all those are recommendations, not the requirements.
Great. And then we just have a few left, so maybe we can just take these from top to bottom. At which phase in the plan check process will this review occur? Will it only be part of the green building plan check or triggered upon project submission?
I think this will be triggered upon project submission because it will be part of your CalGreen documentation and for non-residential. And the WS3 forms or one of the 3 compliance pathways will need to be included to show how it was handled with one of the forms from chapter 8 in the quick guide. So this will be at project submission. You will need to include that.
Great. Is there any sample for compliance workflow?
Compliance.
And the person mentioned the sample that was provided for Title 24.
I'm
confused about the question.
yeah.
Slightly. Maybe she can elaborate.
Okay, the next one is, does interior projects need to comply with any of the pathways?
It depends. Interior project can be you demolish almost all the existing structural elements that keep building together and add new ones. So it depends which structural elements you are keeping and which you are demolishing. Doesn't matter if that's interior or if that's include exterior. That all depends on structure and enclosure that you are maintaining.
Isn't the Horton Plaza an interior concept? Isabel, maybe you could touch a little bit, because I remember on that slide it said interior only for materials and the embodied carbon. I think it would depend on the size of the project again, whether it's interior or large, because if you are maintaining the structure and the enclosure, like in the two examples I showed, they do tend to become interior only, but you know, in one example, we retain the entire enclosure and structure. In the former example, we retain only 65% because it needed significant energy efficiency upgrades. And ventilation rates were updated, etc. So we had to go in and basically cut it down to studs, improve the insulation, improve the vapor barrier, and on the exterior side, the stucco was completely replaced by bamboo, which is a biophilic material. So I think it depends on the size of the project. Yeah. So it would.
Yeah, for Horton Plaza, there were some envelope upgrades, so it wasn't just interior. But yeah, there's examples in both camps. I guess the BSc question, there was a follow-up question of just how will the effectiveness of the new regulations be measured?
Good question, and really hard to answer at this point because regulations are not in effect now, and they will start in July. And after we have some time when those regulations are in effect, again we'll start to have workshops with many people present there, with many departments, many entities. And we will try to collect as much data as possible at that point to have some kind of point of discussion where to move forward with that. So that's as much as I can tell at this point.
Great. Then a pretty specific question, is the back face against earth of a retaining wall included?
If you actually include it in your structural calculations that you retained it and it was reused, then yes, all the power to you. I suggest include it.
Another question about how the compliance will be checked by plan checkers, which has been kind of touched on.
Okay, so verification of the data presented by architects. During the plan check, architects present all type of data on the construction documentation, including egress calculations, plumbing calculations, structural calculations, to name the few, how they are getting verified. Same thing here.
Great. Then there's a question about if you're not required to comply because you're under the minimum, do you need to provide calculations showing that you are exempt?
No.
You
No,
sh-
because under the project data, you will note the project size, and if you're under the threshold, the plan checkers will know that you don't have to comply or you're exempt from that requirement. Just similar to all other requirements. Similar to DSA's requirements if you're under a threshold for ADA compliance, full ADA compliance. So it's pretty much no, because project data will be on the cover sheet and they will be able to judge right away.
Then the next one is there still a threshold of construction valuation of 200K before Cal Green compliance is required?
Yes, in most projects in San Francisco Bay Area per green building ordinances, most projects over $200,000 in construction cost have to comply with Cal Green. So yes, that still holds true.
I think there is a follow-up for a previous question. So the DSA has an increment structure that allows multiple sets to be submitted sequentially under one submittal number. Are all increments counted as one project? So can you address when school projects are submitted to DSA in phases? If each project phase or increment does not trigger the 500,000 square footage, then do they need to comply?
Yeah, and as I said, unfortunately, I cannot answer that question because that is specific for DSA. They are enforcing agency for all the public school projects. And I advise the person who is asking to contact DSA directly and ask this question, because that's a good question, but unfortunately, I cannot answer.
Thank you. And then the last one, if you're doing a TI project and not changing the building core and shell, but you are removing all the existing non-structural partitions and replacing them with new layouts, with all the non-structural partitions be considered structural members for the purpose of needing to comply with Cal Green, or does this project not need to comply at all?
So if it's not part of a structure, no. Structure, primary structure of the building is kept. You are not touching the shell of the building. So you can add whatever you want there or remove whatever you want, like if there are just non-structural walls. Welcome to
I think the starting point would be if it is above that threshold of 100,000 square feet or 50,000 per school. So that'll be the first, direction that would tell which way to go. And even in TI projects, you come across shear walls for lateral performance, and they could be part of the interior. So if your TI project is over 100,000 square feet and you're retaining those shear walls, then it does become like you did retain the structure or you remove the structure. So it all, I think, this question will start from the size of the project and then break it down to what you're retaining and what you're not.
Great. We tackled all the questions and we're just in time. So Sarah, I'll maybe hand it back over to you.
Great. Thank you all for participating. And that was a really great Q&A section. We don't normally get to all of the questions. So that was really great that we were able to have enough time to answer a lot of really, really great questions from the attendees today. And yeah, thank you for participating in the final installment of our Cal Green Embodied Carbon series. It's been really great. I hope the information that we've been able to provide and partnered with SEOC and a lot of our really great members was really beneficial to architects, structural engineers, and other design professionals for the upcoming embodied carbon requirements, again, going into effect July 1st of this year. These resources, the presentation slides, recordings will be made available on the AIA California website and eventually can be a package available on demand as well. So if you wanted to go back and need continuing education credits, those will be available in the coming weeks. Thank you guys again. I have the great slides up here of our really fabulous presenters today. AI California will be submitting for members credit, and members and non-members that qualify will receive a Z&CD certificate of completion. Thank you guys again, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.